In the quiet, peaceful town of Belfast, Maine, life flowed smoothly and serenely. Small houses with white picket fences, green lawns, and manicured gardens, all this created the illusion of an ideal American suburban existence. It would seem that there is no place for drama and tragedy, but in one of these houses, seemingly no different from the others, passions flared up that no one could have predicted. Susan Parks, a 38-year-old housewife, always seemed like the perfect wife and mother. Her husband, a manager at a local company, was almost always busy, and their son was in school. She devoted her days to taking care of the house, cooking dinners, and occasionally meeting with neighbors. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, something very different was going on. Tom Jones, the neighbor's 22-year-old son, had just returned to Belfast after graduating from college. Tall, slender, and charming, he quickly attracted the attention of the local girls, but his interest was focused on Susan. At first, it was casual glances, fleeting conversations over the fence, which gradually developed into something more. Tom often visited her, first under the pretext of helping with the housework, and then without any reason at all. Their relationship developed quickly, and soon innocent conversations turned into a passionate affair. They met when no one could see them. Secret meetings in her house when her husband was at work became something like playing with fire for them. They both understood that their relationship was dangerous and could ruin their lives, but they could not stop. For Susan, Tom was the embodiment of youth and freedom, which she so lacked in her routine. For Tom, Susan became a symbol of forbidden fruit, which beckoned him with its inaccessibility. One evening, after yet another secret tryst, Susan and Tom decided it was time to end their relationship. They knew that continuing the affair could lead to disaster. Tom was going to leave town for a while to let things settle down, and Susan was planning to return to her normal life as if nothing had happened. But fate decreed otherwise. The next morning, neighbors noticed that something was wrong in Susan's house. The police were called, and soon a man's body was found in the living room. Everything in the area froze, as if waiting for an approaching storm. Residents of Belfast, accustomed to a quiet and measured life, did not even suspect what dark secrets were hidden behind the doors of their neighbors' houses. Detective Miller, a seasoned and cool professional, arrived on the scene with Sergeant Lee. When they discovered the body, they knew it was going to be a tough case. But even before the investigation began, one thing was clear. This was a murder that would rock the city. The morning in Belfast began as usual. The early birds were out on the streets, paper boys were dropping the latest issues on doorsteps, and the air was filled with the aroma of coffee being poured onto kitchen tables. Nothing foreshadowed trouble until one of the neighbors, Mr. Harris, noticed something unusual in the house across the street. Susan's house, usually neat and tidy, looked strangely empty that day. The garden lights, which she always turned off at night, were still on, and the front door was slightly open. This alarmed Mr. Harris, who decided to go closer to make sure everything was in order. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. A slight tug on the handle led him inside the house. The first thing that struck him was the silence. Susan's house was always filled with music or the sound of a television, but today it was deathly quiet. Harris took a few steps forward and suddenly noticed a foul odor that grew stronger as he walked deeper into the house. His heart began to beat faster as he moved down the hallway and noticed what looked like blood on the floor. With each step he took, the feeling of horror grew stronger until he entered the living room, where a horrific scene met his gaze. On the floor, surrounded by scattered things, lay the body of a man. His face was distorted in a death grimace, and his shirt was soaked in blood. He recognized the man as his neighbor, Mr. Jones. Harris, shocked by what he saw, ran out of the house and immediately called the police. Soon the entire area was cordoned off, and Belfast residents, who were accustomed to a quiet and measured life, began to take to the streets to find out what had happened. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee were the first to arrive on the scene. They were seasoned cops who had seen a lot of terrible things over the years, but this murder gave them an immediate feeling that this was not going to be a simple case. Miller, after surveying the scene, knew immediately that this was not a simple argument that had turned into a tragedy. There was something much more complicated and confusing going on here. Mr. Jones's body lay on the living room floor in an unnatural position. It was obvious that he had tried to struggle before his death, as there were signs of a struggle on his hands and face. Scattered objects, books, vases, and photographs indicated that a violent fight had taken place in the room. But what interested Miller most was the door to another room, which was slightly open. He carefully peered inside and saw another strange detail. A woman's shoe was lying on the floor. Miller carefully picked up the shoe and examined it. It was obviously expensive, and its owner could only be one of the local residents, who did not have many such things. This was the first clue that could lead to a solution to this terrible crime. Sergeant Lee, who was checking other rooms at the time, found several odd details in Susan's bedroom. Clothes were scattered around the room, and the bed looked like someone had recently lain on it. He noticed a phone on the nightstand next to the bed, which was turned on, but no one answered the calls that had been coming in since early morning. After the initial inspection and evidence gathering, Detective Miller decided to immediately begin questioning neighbors. His first choice was to speak to Susan, but when he got to her house, she was not there. This seemed odd, since she was always home at this time of day. Questioning neighbors didn't reveal much. No one had seen anyone enter or leave Susan's house the night before. The only thing they noticed was that the lights in her house were on much longer than usual late at night. These small details only complicated the picture, leaving more questions than answers. Meanwhile, Sergeant Lee continued his search of the Jones home. In the kitchen, he found 2 glasses with wine residue on the table, one of which was dented, as if someone had squeezed it too hard. This indicated that there had been another woman in the house. All the evidence pointed to passions involved in this tragedy, which could have been sparked by jealousy or betrayal. Detective Miller knew the case was taking a new turn. Someone in this quiet town was hiding a terrible truth, and he had to find the answers. But most importantly, he had to find Susan, who he suspected knew much more than she seemed at first glance. The day after the body was found, Belfast no longer seemed as calm and peaceful as it had been before. News of the brutal murder spread like wildfire through the city, causing residents to talk about it on every corner. Small groups of people gathered in the streets and shops, discussing the latest rumors and speculations. But while the city was plunged into fear and bewilderment, Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee continued to work, gradually uncovering the details of this intricate case. Miller spent a sleepless night studying the evidence and analyzing the data he had collected. He knew that in such cases, it was important not to miss even the smallest detail. The evidence found at the crime scene already indicated that the murder was not random. It looked as if it was the result of some deep conflict. But who could have been involved in this tragedy? Early that morning, Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee went to the station to review the initial investigation report and gather more information. They began by interviewing Mr. Harris, the neighbor who had discovered the body. Harris was shaken and could not really explain what had driven him to enter Susan's house. But when asked if he had seen anything suspicious in the last few days, he merely shrugged. The only thing he remembered was hearing some rustling noises in Susan's house the night before the murder, but he did not attach any importance to it. The station also began receiving calls from other residents of the city. Some claimed to have seen Tom Jones, the victim's son, near Susan's house late at night, but no one could give an exact time. Miller realized this could be the key to solving the case and decided to question Tom immediately. When Tom arrived at the police station, he looked visibly agitated. The young man was clearly under stress, and Miller, being an experienced detective, noticed it immediately. He invited Tom into his office and asked him to sit down. A standard interrogation interview began, in which Miller tried to get Tom to give an alibi for the time of the murder. Tom said that he was at home that evening, doing his own thing and not going outside. However, Miller noticed that his hands were shaking, and his gaze was absent-minded. Tom kept turning away, avoiding direct eye contact, which further increased the detective's suspicions. Miller decided to change tactics slightly and start asking questions related to Susan. Tom visibly tensed up when he heard her name. When asked if he knew Susan and if he had been in contact with her, Tom responded evasively, stating that they were just neighbors and nothing more. However, this did not satisfy Miller, and he began to press Tom, asking him increasingly specific questions about his relationship with Susan. Tom began to get nervous. He tried to evade the question, but Miller did not give in. At some point, Tom could not stand it any longer and stood up abruptly, declaring that he had nothing more to say and wanted to leave. Miller let him go, but noted that Tom's behavior only increased his suspicions. He felt that Tom was hiding something, and this could be the key to the solution. While Sergeant Lee was looking through other evidence and reporting on the tracks he had found, Miller decided to talk to the Jones family. He went to Tom's house to interview his mother, Mrs. Jones. The woman looked exhausted and devastated, unable to believe that her husband had been murdered. Mrs. Jones said that over the past few months her husband had become increasingly suspicious and had frequent arguments with Tom. She did not know what the reason was, but she noticed that their arguments were becoming increasingly violent. Her husband complained that Tom was spending too much time away from home, but he did not provide any other specific details. When Miller began asking about Susan, Mrs. Jones's eyes filled with tears. She didn't want to believe that her son could be connected to this woman, but she admitted that they did cross paths often. For the past few months, she had noticed that Tom was coming home late and avoiding conversations with his parents. These new details began to fit together. It became clear to Miller that there had been some kind of relationship between Susan and Tom that Tom's father, Mr. Jones, might not have approved of. This could have led to the conflict that led to the murder. The detective decided that now was the time to look more closely into the connections between Susan and Tom. He went to Susan's house, hoping to find her there. However, the house was empty, and Susan seemed to have disappeared. This raised a new wave of suspicion in Miller. Susan's disappearance after the murder was too suspicious to be an accident. Miller ordered Sergeant Lee to send out requests to hospitals and nearby towns to find Susan. He also ordered a search of Tom's home to see if there were any signs or clues that could link him to the murder. Miller knew he had to act quickly, while the evidence was still fresh and Susan had not traveled too far. Thus, the first wave of suspicion began to gather around Tom and Susan. Miller felt that they were both involved in this case, and he was ready to go to the end to uncover the truth. But at the same time, he understood that this story was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance, and he still had a lot of work to do to put together all the pieces of this dark puzzle. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee began to sift through the evidence, trying to understand what exactly happened that fateful night. Now that the prime suspects, Tom and Susan, were under close surveillance, it was time to figure out how their relationship could have led to such a horrific crime. Miller's first step was to go back to the files on Tom and Susan's phones. They requested all the call and text messages they'd made over the past few months. As they pored over the data, they began to find evidence that Tom and Susan's relationship was more than just friendly. The messages they found contained explicit confessions and arrangements for secret meetings that took place when her husband and Tom's family couldn't reach them. Miller was particularly interested in one of the last conversations, which took place just a few days before the murder. In this conversation, Tom clearly expressed concern that their secret could be revealed. He tried to persuade Susan to change something in their relationship, to stop something, or conversely to take more decisive measures. Susan responded evasively, expressing fear of possible consequences. This dialogue made the detective understand that a conflict was brewing in their relationship, which could become the impetus for tragedy. With this information in hand, Miller and Lee decided to conduct a second search of Susan's home, paying particular attention to her bedroom and workspace. During the search, the detectives found a box of letters in one of the closets that Susan and Tom had been exchanging over the past few months. The letters were passionate and full of emotion, further confirming the seriousness of their affair. Among the letters were several that mentioned a plan. This alerted Miller. He studied each line carefully and realized that it was a plan to leave town to hide from those around him, but the letters lacked specific details. This made Miller wonder. Perhaps the murder was unintentional and events were unfolding faster than they had planned. Meanwhile, Sergeant Lee continued to examine other evidence found in Tom's home. In his room, he found notes written on scraps of paper, in which Tom described his feelings and fears about his relationship with Susan. These notes were not significant in themselves, but they added context to the overall picture and showed that Tom was seriously involved in the relationship and was under a lot of emotional strain. The real discovery, however, was the diary found in Tom's desk drawer. In it, Tom detailed his encounters with Susan and how their relationship had evolved over time. In his final entries before the murder, he wrote of his despair and fear that their affair would be discovered, especially by his father. Tom described how his father became increasingly interested in his personal life and how he would increasingly find Tom when he returned from Susan's visits. The last entries were especially important. In one of them, Tom wrote about a conversation with his father that took place literally the day before the murder. In this entry, Tom mentioned that his father suspected him of something and threatened to get to the bottom of everything. Miller realized that Tom's father, Mr. Jones, probably already knew about his son's affair with Susan, which could have caused their quarrel and subsequent murder. This new information became the basis for further investigation. Miller and Lee suggested that on the night of the murder, Mr. Jones, having learned about the relationship between Tom and Susan, could have tried to confront them, which led to the tragedy. But to confirm this version, additional evidence and witness testimony were needed. Miller ordered his men to interview the neighbors again and gather all possible information about what happened on the night of the murder. Particular attention was paid to those who might have seen or heard something unusual, but did not attach any importance to it at the time. One of the neighbors, who lived in the house across the street, recalled hearing loud screams coming from Susan's house late that night. He described the screams as short but very loud, and then everything went quiet. This witness also noted that a man then came out of the house and quickly disappeared into the darkness. Although he could not describe exactly who it was, his testimony added another important element to the picture. Miller and Lee decided that they needed to try to find Susan as soon as possible. They were now sure that she was involved in this case much more deeply than they had initially thought. Susan's disappearance and her connection to Tom now looked not just suspicious, but part of a well-thought-out plan. While searching for Susan, Miller decided to question Tom again, now with new evidence in hand. He wanted to find out exactly what happened that night and what Tom's role was in the murder. The detective knew that Tom would have little chance of evading the truth when all the evidence was laid out before him. In the police office, Tom sat with his head down. This time, Miller was more stern and demanding. He immediately showed Tom the diary and letters found in Susan's house. Tom turned pale when he saw the familiar pages, and his hands began to shake again. "We know about your affair with Susan, Tom," Miller said firmly, "and we know your father found out about it. What happened that night? Why did your father end up dead?" Tom tried to say something, but his voice shook and he couldn't get the words out. Miller kept pressing him, and at some point Tom finally couldn't take it anymore. He admitted that he had actually met Susan, and that they had been planning to run away from town. He said that his father had caught them together at Susan's house that night, and that they had had a terrible fight. Tom described how his father became furious when he learned the truth. He threatened to tell his wife Susan everything and ruin their lives. At this point, an argument broke out between them, which turned into a fight. Tom eventually admitted that he had lost his temper and had hit his father when he attacked Susan. He had not realized how hard he had hit him until he saw his father lying unconscious and bleeding on the floor. After this, Tom and Susan panicked. They didn't know what to do and decided to just disappear, hoping that no one would find out what really happened. But now that all the evidence was against them, Tom could no longer hide the truth. Detective Miller, hearing Tom's confession, knew it was the culmination of a complex drama unfolding in this quiet town. But there were still questions to be answered. Where was Susan now? And could she also be involved in the murder? Tom's confession was an important step toward uncovering the truth. But to complete the investigation, Detective Miller and his team needed to gather additional evidence that could corroborate their version of events and bring those responsible to justice. The main objective at this stage was to find out the whereabouts of Susan, whose actions remained a mystery. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee decided to expand the search for Susan. They contacted other police departments in neighboring cities and states, sending out inquiries about possible movements or incidents involving her. Wanted posters with her photo were sent to all police stations and hospitals in the area. Miller knew that Susan might try to hide, but he also knew that sooner or later she would make a mistake. Meanwhile, Sergeant Lee continued to analyze Tom's cell phone data. Among recent calls and messages, they found a number that caught their attention. The number had appeared frequently in phone records over the past few days. Miller ordered an investigation into its ownership, and it soon became clear that the number was registered to one of Susan's distant relatives, who lived in the neighboring state of New Hampshire. The detectives decided to act quickly. They arranged a visit to New Hampshire, assuming that Susan might be hiding with a relative. At the house, they were met by an elderly man who, upon learning the purpose of the visit, became visibly nervous. Miller, realizing that they were close to their goal, began asking questions. After several minutes of intense questioning, the man admitted that Susan had indeed visited him a couple of days earlier, but had only stayed a few hours. She had been worried, and as he said, out of her mind. She told him about the terrible events that had taken place in Belfast, and how she and Tom had found themselves in the middle of this nightmare. The man also mentioned that Susan had left, saying she was going to hide in a secluded spot on the coast. She left him with only one phrase that he remembered. "I can't run anymore, but I can't stay either." This made the detectives even more wary. They realized that Susan might be in a dangerous psychological state, and her actions could be unpredictable. With this information in hand, Miller and Lee continued their search, heading toward the area where they thought Susan might be. They noted several small hotels and rental cottages along the coast where she might be hiding. Checking hotel logs and asking locals yielded results. At one of the hotels, located on the very edge of the bay, a woman matching Susan's description had checked in a few days earlier under an assumed name. Miller and Lee immediately set out for the location, determined to finish the job and bring Susan back to Belfast. When they arrived, the hotel looked deserted and abandoned. The owner of the hotel reported that the woman they had inquired about had barely left her room and seemed depressed and anxious. The detectives approached the door of her room carefully. Miller knocked, but there was no answer. He tried again, this time using her name. "Susan, we know you're in there. We need to talk." After what seemed like an eternity, the door slowly opened. Susan stood there, her eyes wide with fatigue and fear. She knew she'd been found, and there was no point in running. Miller and Lee gently ushered her into the room and began asking questions. Susan paused for a long moment, as if collecting her thoughts, and then began to tell her version of events. Her story was full of contradictions, but one thing became clear. She had not planned the murder. She described how Mr. Jones had broken into her home that night and made threats, and then a fight had broken out that had gotten out of hand. Susan claimed that when Tom hit his father, she had tried to separate them, but it had all happened too quickly. As Susan told her story, Miller became increasingly convinced that she was telling the truth. Her confession revealed how scared and confused she had been that night. But there was still doubt about whether everything had really happened as she described. The detectives knew they had to check her words against the evidence they already had. When they returned to Belfast, Susan was arrested and remanded in custody for further investigation. Meanwhile, Miller and Lee continued to review all the data and evidence they had collected to finally confirm or deny her version of events. One of the key pieces of evidence was the fingerprints and blood found in Susan's home. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Mr. Jones, and signs of a struggle indicated that there had indeed been a fight in the room. Tom and Susan's fingerprints were everywhere, confirming their presence at the crime scene. Further investigation was also conducted into the financial transactions of Susan and Tom. It was discovered that they had withdrawn a large sum of money from their accounts a few days before the murder, which confirmed their intention to flee. This evidence further strengthened the theory that the murder was spontaneous and not pre-planned. Tom's testimony, the letters and diary he found, and Susan's testimony allowed Miller to piece together a nearly complete picture of the events. The evidence and testimony spoke for themselves. The tragedy was the result of passion, fear, and rash decisions. Now the detectives had one last task: to piece together all the evidence and prepare the case for trial. They knew their work was coming to an end, but they knew that this case would remain in the memory of Belfast residents for a long time, as an example of how secret passions can lead to irreversible consequences. With each passing day, the investigation became clearer. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee had almost completed collecting all the evidence, but now they needed to focus on the motives that led to the tragic events. In this part of the investigation, They focused on fully understanding what exactly was the catalyst for Mr. Jones's murder. The first step was to delve deeper into the relationship between Tom and Susan. Miller carefully studied the letters they exchanged. These letters showed how complex and contradictory their relationship was. On the one hand, Tom was a young man thirsting for freedom and new experiences. He saw in Susan not only a woman, but also salvation from the boredom and monotony of provincial life. Susan, in turn, was deeply dissatisfied with her life. Her marriage, which seemed perfect on the outside, had long since lost its meaning for her. In Tom, she found what she lacked: passion, youth, attention. However, as their relationship progressed, both began to realize that they were caught in a trap with no easy way out. Tom began to realize that his relationship with Susan was becoming increasingly dangerous, especially when his father began to suspect that something was wrong. Mr. Jones, a man of strict morals and traditional values, felt that something was wrong with his family structure. He began to notice that his son was becoming distant and mysterious, which only increased his suspicions. Miller also looked into the financial aspects of Tom and Susan's lives. He discovered that Susan had been secretly transferring large sums of money into an account used by Tom. This suggested that the two were planning a future together, perhaps even an escape from Belfast. But these plans proved too dangerous, and Mr. Jones, it turned out, was a serious obstacle to them. The investigation also revealed another interesting fact. A few weeks before the murder, Mr. Jones had asked a private detective to follow his son. He wanted to find out what was really going on. The private detective's report mentioned several meetings between Tom and Susan, which they had carefully hidden. When Mr. Jones learned about them, he was furious. He felt that his family was being destroyed right before his eyes, and this forced him to act decisively. Miller knew that this motive was key. The father, having learned of his son's secret meetings with a married woman, was ready to take extreme measures to protect the honor of his family. This knowledge could push him to have a frank conversation with his son and Susan, which ultimately ended in tragedy. Meanwhile, Sergeant Lee continued to interrogate Susan. He tried to understand her motives and her role in what had happened. Susan seemed to be overcome with guilt and fear. She admitted that she had not meant to let the situation get to this point, but she did not know how to stop the disaster that was unfolding. She said that she loved Tom, but she knew their relationship was doomed. The night Mr. Jones broke into her home, she tried to stop the conflict, but things did not go as she expected. Lee also discovered that Susan had serious psychological problems related to her marriage. Her husband was cold and indifferent to her feelings, and she sought solace in her relationship with Tom. This left her vulnerable and susceptible to passion, which eventually led to irreparable consequences. In parallel with the interviews and document analysis, Miller decided to conduct another examination of the crime scene to ensure that no important details had been missed. During his second examination, he noticed a small, barely noticeable detail. There were traces of blood on the carpet in the living room where the murder had occurred, but they did not match the general picture of a fight. These traces indicated that Mr. Jones's body may have been moved after his death. This discovery got Miller thinking. Had Susan or Tom tried to hide evidence or change the crime scene to confuse the investigation? Or were they acting in a panic, unsure of what to do after what had happened? The answers to these questions might provide a final understanding of the events of that night. Miller knew that the key now was to piece together the details to understand what had driven Tom and Susan to act in the way that led to Mr. Jones's death. He also knew that the truth might be more complex than it initially appeared, and it was his job to uncover that complexity and present it in court. Having completed his analysis of all the clues and evidence, Miller prepared a final report. In it, the detective described in detail the events leading up to the murder and the motives that moved those involved. He emphasized that although the murder was spontaneous, its roots were in deep personal and emotional conflicts that led to the disaster. As the trial approached, Miller and Lee knew their work was not done. They had to present this case to the court, prove the guilt of the suspects, and seek justice for the victim. But they also knew that this case would leave an indelible mark on them as an example of how human passions can lead to tragedy, destroying the life of an entire family. The final stage of the investigation was full of tension and anticipation. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee prepared for the final stage. the arrest and subsequent trial. All the evidence was collected, the motives were established, and now all that remained was to formally charge Tom and Susan. The next morning, they went to the station, preparing to meet with the district attorney. The prosecutor reviewed the case and agreed with Miller's findings. He gave the green light for the arrest and charges. Miller knew that this moment would be crucial not only for them, but for the entire Belfast community, which was eagerly awaiting justice. The detectives first went to Tom, who had been under police surveillance since his confession. They knew he had realized the gravity of his actions, but an arrest was inevitable. When Miller and Lee entered his home, Tom was sitting in the living room, surrounded by memories of the past. He looked lost and tired, knowing his life would never be the same. "Tom Jones, you are under arrest for the murder of your father, Mr. Jones," Miller said coldly as he handcuffed him. Tom did not resist. He hung his head silently, realizing that his confession and actions had led to this point. In that moment, he was not the defiant young man he had been before. He was a broken man, fully aware of his mistakes. After arresting Tom, the detectives went to Susan. She was in even worse shape than Tom. Susan remained in custody, awaiting her arrest. When Miller and Lee entered her cell, she was sitting on her bed, staring at a spot on the wall. The only sounds were her quiet sighs. Miller walked up to her and announced, "Susan Parks, you are under arrest for accessory after the fact to the murder of Mr. Jones." Susan, hearing this, slowly raised her head and looked at Miller. There was a mixture of despair and resignation in her eyes. She said nothing, but her look said that she was ready to take punishment for what she had done. Accompanied by detectives, she left the cell and headed for the car that was supposed to take her to prison. On the way to the station, Lee tried to understand what motivated people like Susan and Tom, what made them take such steps. He understood that this was not just a crime, but the result of complex human relationships, where passion and fear prevailed over reason. These thoughts did not give him peace. Meanwhile, in Belfast, word of the investigation and the arrests spread like wildfire. The city's residents, who had been following the case for a long time, finally had answers to their questions. But the answers brought not only satisfaction, but also bitterness. People they knew and respected had been implicated in a terrible crime, and it had shaken the community. In court, when the trial began, the prosecutor presented all the evidence he had collected to prove Tom and Susan's guilt. It showed how their passionate relationship and fear of exposure had led to tragic consequences. Letters, phone records, neighbors' testimonies. All of this became irrefutable evidence that the murder was not accidental, but the result of accumulated conflicts and tensions. Tom and Susan both pleaded guilty. Tom took primary responsibility for the murder, claiming that he had stabbed his father to death. Susan, in turn, admitted that her actions and involvement in the relationship had led to the tragedy, although she had not wanted it to happen. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, handed down a sentence that was meant to be a fair punishment for what had been done. Tom was sentenced to a long prison term for his father's murder, and Susan was sentenced to prison for her part in the crime and for attempting to cover it up. The trial was over, but for the people of Belfast, the story would be etched in their memories for years to come. A city that had always seemed peaceful and safe had become a witness to the destructive forces of human passion and despair. Detective Miller and Sergeant Lee, having completed this case, realized that their job is not only to find criminals and bring them to justice, but also to understand what drives people in their actions. This case became a lesson for them, reminding them that behind every crime there are real people with their emotions, fears, and passions. When Miller returned home after the final court hearing, he felt relief. But that relief was mixed with sadness, because he knew that this story had left a mark not only on the lives of those involved in the crime, but also on his own soul. The story of passion, fear, and murder in Belfast was over. But life in the city went on, and the detectives knew that new cases, new mysteries, and new lessons lay ahead.